He left 3 black girls in the rain at a gas station. No goodbye, no explanation. 25 years later, they walked into his boardroom, owning everything he built. And that was just the beginning. He left them in the rain like garbage. "You're not my kids," Ed Frankel snapped, slamming the Mercedes door shut, leaving 3 identical 14-year-old girls huddled under a flickering gas station sign in rural Georgia. They were drenched, shivering, and motherless, fresh from burying the only parent who had ever loved them. But what they didn't know that night, what he never imagined, was that those same 3 abandoned girls would return 25 years later not as victims, but as visionaries. And they wouldn't be begging. They'd be taking everything. This is not just a story of betrayal. This is a story about what happens when injustice festers, when daughters are erased, and when the truth buried with a mother claws its way back to the surface with the fury of blood and legacy. Ed Frankel, the celebrated CEO of Frankel Hotels, was hailed as a self-made mogul, but behind every chandelier in his empire was a stolen dream. Behind every 5-star suite, the ghost of a woman named Kathy Lawrence, his late wife and the real founder of it all. And behind every polished press release was a lie big enough to destroy him. Because the triplets weren't just Kathy's daughters. They were Ed's. And he knew it. Maybe not the first year, maybe not the second. But eventually he saw it in Debbie's fierce loyalty, in Suzanne's unshakable command, in Doris's quiet brilliance. That DNA didn't lie, even if he did. Now they're back. Not as broken little girls, but as the heads of Triple Crown Investments, a stealth startup turned corporate titan built from the ruins of the trust their mother left behind. Armed with a key, a locket, and the truth, they've taken control of his real estate arm and are about to claim the crown jewel Frankel Hotels itself. But what starts as a hostile takeover spirals into a murder investigation when long-buried evidence suggests their mother's death wasn't natural. As secrets unravel, allies shift, and ghosts speak, the sisters must decide what kind of justice they seek and what price they're willing to pay for it. Will they become what he was, or will they finish what their mother started? If you think this is just another revenge story, think again. This is blood. This is legacy. This is the daughters he tried to erase. The rain came down like judgment. It wasn't a gentle drizzle or even a passing storm. It was the kind of relentless downpour that made everything look uglier, colder, more cruel. Ed Frankel didn't flinch as he stepped out of the driver's seat of his silver Mercedes, the wheels still hot from the 2-hour drive. He didn't look back at the 3 young girls huddled in the back seat, Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris, each soaked through their thin jackets, their knees pulled to their chests, eyes wide with a fear they hadn't learned how to name yet. They were 14, triplets, daughters of his late wife Kathy. Not his blood, he had always insisted, not his responsibility, not his burden to carry. And now, without Kathy alive to force his hand, he didn't even have to pretend. He tossed a crumpled envelope onto the seat, $200 in cash and a copy of Kathy's death certificate, and slammed the car door shut. "You'll figure it out," he muttered, barely audible above the rain, then added coldly, "You're not my kids." The engine revved, headlights cutting through the mist, and then the car disappeared down the wet highway, leaving only the smell of gasoline and betrayal in its wake. The gas station lights flickered as the girls stood in silence, abandoned not just by a man, but by the last sliver of normalcy they had left. Somewhere in Suzanne's coat pocket, a necklace with a locket. The only thing their mother had given them before she died, glowed faintly in the dim light. They didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside each of them fractured quietly and permanently. That night they weren't just orphaned. They were erased. For a long moment after the car disappeared, the only sound was the pounding of the rain and the distant hum of trucks on the highway. Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris stood frozen under the overhang of the gas station, their hair plastered to their faces, clothes clinging to their growing bodies, hearts thudding with a numbness that didn't yet have a name. They were 14, too old to be coddled, too young to be left to survive alone. And yet, that was exactly what had happened. No luggage, no instructions, no backup plan. Just $200 in damp cash and a death certificate that felt like a death sentence. The man who had tucked them into bed after their mother's funeral just days earlier had vanished into the night, abandoning them like yesterday's regrets. The gas station clerk, a wiry man with a thick southern drawl and nicotine-stained fingers, glanced at them warily through the fogged-up window, unsure whether to call the police or pretend he didn't see anything. Debbie, the oldest by 2 minutes, was the first to move her fingers, gripping her sister's hands tightly. Suzanne trembled but said nothing while Doris stared blankly ahead, her mind retreating behind a fortress of silence. They weren't just lost, they were invisible. No one knew they were here. No one was coming. The world had shifted under their feet, and all that remained was each other. In that moment, they understood something most adults spent decades avoiding: that safety is a myth, family is fragile, and childhood can end in a single cruel moment. That rainy night on the roadside wasn't just the end of their innocence, it was the beginning of their reckoning. Just 3 days earlier, the girls had stood in black dresses at the edge of their mother's grave, clutching white lilies with trembling hands as the final shovel of earth hit the coffin with a hollow thud. Kathy Lawrence, brilliant architect, gentle soul, fierce protector, had been everything to them. Her death from a sudden illness had shattered the only real structure of love and safety they had ever known. And now the man who had promised Kathy he would care for them, the man who had lived in their home, shared their dinners, attended school plays with a strained smile, had turned cold as stone the moment the last condolence card faded from the counter. "I was never your father," Ed had said just hours before abandoning them, his voice sharp, deliberate, final. The girls had stood frozen in the hallway of their own home, the walls still smelling faintly of their mother's perfume, as he packed his briefcase and walked past them without flinching. "I married your mother, not you. Don't confuse the two," he added, slipping on his watch like he was late for a meeting, not ending the lives of 3 children. It didn't matter that they had called him Dad for most of their lives. It didn't matter that he had sat beside Kathy in the hospital pretending to care. Now that she was gone, his mask had dropped completely. Debbie's voice had cracked when she whispered, "But we're family." And Ed had stared at her like she was a stranger. "No, sweetheart. You're an obligation." And now not even that. The door had slammed, and with it, the lie they had believed their entire childhood came crashing down, that he had ever loved them at all. As Ed Frankel sped away into the storm, his taillights disappeared behind a curtain of rain, leaving behind nothing but exhaust fumes, and the final proof of his indifference, $200 crumpled dollars shoved into a torn envelope, tossed carelessly on the passenger seat like a tip for a stranger's inconvenience. He didn't glance in the rearview mirror. He didn't wonder what would happen to the girls once the gas station closed, once the night deepened, and the world revealed its sharp edges. To him, they were a chapter closed, a responsibility he never wanted, an inconvenience finally disposed of. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to learn, was that Kathy had planned for the possibility of betrayal. Hidden in the lining of Debbie's coat, sewn in with careful maternal precision, was a silver locket the girls had always assumed was just sentimental. Inside, tucked beneath a tiny photo of the 3 of them with their mother at the beach, was a miniature key no larger than a fingernail. None of the girls noticed it that night. Not yet. They were too shaken, too cold, too newly orphaned to think beyond the hour. But that key, crafted in secrecy, left behind with purpose, would one day unlock a safety deposit box containing the real will of Kathy Lawrence, blueprints of a hotel empire she helped design, and a paper trail that traced the theft of everything she'd built straight back to Ed Frankel. He thought he had silenced her legacy. He had no idea he had just placed the beginning of his downfall into the very hands of the daughters he'd just abandoned. The man was gone. All that remained was the slick trail of tire marks disappearing into the fog, and a crumpled envelope that lay half-soaked in rainwater near the curb. Inside it, exactly $200 in cash, folded with mechanical precision. No note, no explanation. No, just cash, like hush money. The girls didn't move. Debbie clutched the envelope tightly, unsure whether to scream or throw it into the gutter. Suzanne wiped her face with her sleeve, not to dry tears but to clear her vision, while Doris stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped tightly around her own body like armor. None of them spoke. None of them had to. But what Ed Frankel didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that in the lining of Doris's jacket, sewn in with invisible thread, was a silver locket their mother had given them on her final night in the hospital. Kathy had been too weak to speak much, but she had pressed the necklace into Doris's hand and whispered, "When the time is right, open it. It holds the key." At first they had thought she meant metaphorically, but tucked inside the tiny locket beyond the photo of Kathy holding them, as babies, was a miniature key no larger than a fingernail. They didn't yet know what it opened. A safe deposit box, a locker, a drawer. But one day they would find out. And when they did, it would unravel everything Ed Frankel thought he had buried forever. For now, the locket lay cold against Doris's chest, hidden but humming with purpose, waiting patiently for justice to wake. It wasn't until the girls were safe in Rosa Taylor's warm, book-filled home that the truth began to take shape. Rosa, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with the calm gravity of someone who had seen too much, didn't waste time with pleasantries. She wrapped each girl in a dry blanket, handed them hot cocoa, and then locked the front door with a heavy click, as if sealing them off from the cruelty of the world outside. "Your mother knew this might happen," she said quietly, sitting across from them at the dining table. Kathy wasn't naive. She didn't trust Ed, not after the way he treated her those last few years. The girls leaned in, hearts pounding. Rosa reached into a fireproof safe tucked beneath the staircase and pulled out a manila envelope thick with documents. Inside was the original trust Kathy had drawn up, signed, notarized, and kept completely separate from Ed Frankel's knowledge or influence. The papers outlined a private fund established in their names, protected under a unique clause that kicked in only upon Kathy's death. This trust, Rosa explained, was built from properties and patents Kathy owned before her marriage to Ed. She kept them in her name with my help, and now legally they belong to you. Debbie's hands trembled as she reached for the documents. Suzanne scanned the financial summary, her eyes widening as she read. Doris just stared at Rosa, blinking in disbelief. "But he said we had nothing," she whispered. Rosa's voice was firm. "He lied. You have more than you think. Your mother made sure of that. And this is just the beginning." In that moment, a flicker of hope cut through the fog of betrayal. Maybe they weren't powerless. Maybe Kathy hadn't just left them behind. Maybe she had left them a way forward. Kathy Lawrence had always been a woman of instinct. She could sense when a building's foundation was unstable just by standing in the foyer, and she could read a person's intentions faster than most could process a handshake. So when the migraines turned to seizures and the doctors started using words like aggressive and inoperable, Kathy didn't waste time hoping for miracles. She knew she was dying, and she knew Ed Frankel would not mourn her for long. In fact, she suspected he was already thinking about what came next, what he could take, what he could claim. He had already begun subtly edging her out of her own designs, rebranding her hotel concepts under his name, signing contracts she never saw, and making executive decisions with board members she didn't trust. She didn't confront him, not directly. Instead, she moved in silence, transferring titles, liquidating dormant assets, setting up shell companies under her maiden name. Every step was calculated, every account was hidden, and with Rosa's legal help, she began drafting the trust that would bypass Ed entirely. "He'll come for everything," Kathy had whispered one evening to Rosa from her hospital bed. "But he won't get what matters. Not the girls, not the vision, not the legacy." She scribbled notes between treatments, drawing diagrams of hotels she would never build, writing letters she might never send. Her biggest fear wasn't death, it was erasure. That Ed would rewrite the story of who she was, and worse, that he would convince her daughters they had no inheritance, no power, no truth to claim. But Kathy was never one to go down quietly. And so brick by brick, clause by clause, she built her final masterpiece, not of steel and stone, but of protection, foresight, and love disguised as legal armor. That night, as rain continued to patter softly against the windows of Rosa Taylor's house, the three sisters sat huddled together on an old velvet couch wrapped in blankets, but still shaking from the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they now knew. The fire crackled in front of them, casting flickering shadows on their young faces that suddenly looked much older than 14. Rosa had gone to bed, giving them space, but the silence between the girls wasn't empty. It was heavy with a vow that hadn't yet been spoken, but was already carved into the marrow of their bones. Debbie was the first to speak, her voice hoarse but steady. "We survive, no matter what." Suzanne nodded slowly, her eyes still on the documents Rosa had left on the coffee table, the trust, the evidence, the beginnings of a roadmap. "And we learn. We don't just survive, we prepare. We get smart enough to beat him at his own game." Then Doris, quiet and unreadable for so long, finally looked up and whispered, "We take it back. All of it. For her." That was the moment it happened, not with ceremony, but with clarity. The three sisters, soaked in grief but lit with resolve, made a silent pact to grow into the kind of women who couldn't be erased. They would study harder than anyone else. They would become architects, lawyers, strategists, not for wealth, not even for revenge, but to reclaim the legacy their mother built and ensure the man who took everything would one day answer for it. They were just girls then. But in that moment they became something else entirely. Survivors with purpose, daughters with a mission, and the quiet architects of a storm that would come 25 years later to shake the empire that tried to forget them. In the months that followed, as Rosa began homeschooling the girls while handling the legal maintenance of the trust, the sisters uncovered pieces of a story they had never been told, one their mother had carefully hidden, not out of shame but for their protection. Among Kathy's documents was a worn, leather-bound notebook filled with architectural sketches, margin notes and names they didn't recognize at first, hotel names that had never been built, locations pinned with strategic intent, and detailed renderings of luxury spaces with a unique design signature. But what stood out most wasn't the brilliance of the concepts, it was the name signed at the bottom of every page: Steve Lawrence. At first, they thought it was a partner, maybe a designer Kathy had once worked with. But the deeper they dug with Rosa's cautious help, the more the truth came into focus. Steve wasn't just a collaborator, he was their biological father. A black architect whose visionary work had been buried under the shadow of a white businessman's name. Kathy and Steve had created the blueprint for what would later become Frankel Hotels, before Ed Frankel ever entered the picture. Photos buried in Kathy's personal box showed a younger Kathy and Steve laughing over blueprints standing on the site of what would eventually be Frankel's flagship resort. Letters between them spoke of shared dreams, long nights, and the life they had planned to build together before Steve mysteriously disappeared from their lives. Rosa confirmed what Kathy never got to say out loud. Ed had stolen not just Kathy's work, but her legacy with Steve. Frankel Hotels, the empire Ed claimed as his own, had been born from the minds and hearts of two people in love, one of them erased by design. That discovery didn't just rewrite their understanding of the past, it redefined what and who they were fighting for. They called it Triple Crown Investments, a name, born one quiet night when the girls were 16, sitting on Rosa Taylor's porch beneath a sky full of stars. It was Doris who whispered the phrase first, half joking, referencing the fact that they were triplets, 3 daughters, 3 minds, 1 legacy to reclaim. But the name stuck. It held power. It sounded like victory. From that moment on, everything they did was in service of that name and the silent mission it carried. They didn't announce their plans to the world. There were no press releases, no social media posts, no dramatic unveilings. Instead, they worked in shadows and silence, honoring their mother's meticulous approach. While others rushed toward success, they built deliberately. Debbie studied architecture and design, determined to master the craft her mother and father had once shared. Suzanne devoured law and business like a soldier preparing for war, understanding every legal loophole and contract clause that could protect or destroy an empire. And Doris immersed herself in economics, branding, and market analytics, learning the language of valuation and risk so fluently that few ever questioned her projections. For 25 years, they invested, observed, and acquired. They created shell companies and layered trust structures. They bought up distressed properties, flipped them under other names, and funneled profits back into their core entity, Triple Crown Investments. And slowly, quietly, they began buying into Frankel Hotels, not directly, That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, they targeted third-party subsidiaries, supplier chains, and forgotten real estate branches. By the time Ed Frankel realized a new competitor was rising in the luxury space, it was already too late. Debbie, who had inherited Kathy's eye and Steve Lawrence's quiet genius, enrolled in the most rigorous architecture and design programs she could find. While others designed for style, Debbie designed with soul buildings that breathed, that told stories, that whispered echoes of the legacy stolen from her mother. She spent summers sketching floor plans in silence, letting grief turn into precision. Her work spoke where she could not. Meanwhile, Doris, the least verbal but most observant, chose the path of systems and influence. She majored in marketing and hotel management, determined to understand not only what made a brand thrive, but what made people believe in it. She studied behavioral economics, customer loyalty psychology, and brand equity manipulation until she could dismantle a competitor's strategy just by glancing at their ad campaign. Together, their fields formed a Trinity Law design and operation, the very same triangle that had built Frankel Hotels decades ago through Kathy and Steve's original vision. But this time, it wouldn't be stolen. Each degree, each sleepless night, each exam, internship, and business simulation was another stone in the foundation of their return. And they didn't just study for themselves, they studied for her. For the woman who had died building a legacy someone else had claimed. They were the living embodiment of Kathy's unfinished blueprint. It began with whispers, small transactions, forgotten parcels of land, undervalued assets, buried deep within the real estate arm of Frankel Hotels. The sisters knew better than to confront Ed Frankel head-on, especially while he was still being hailed in business circles as a visionary. Instead, they went underground, operating through shell companies and offshore entities, allowing Triple Crown Investments to quietly accumulate leverage piece by piece. Doris was the first to identify a sleepy real estate holding company in Arizona that Frankel Hotels had neglected for years. Its valuation was low, but its portfolio included development rights adjacent to 3 of the chain's top-performing resorts. With one strategic acquisition, the sisters controlled not just the land, but the future expansion of the Frankel brand in the Southwest. From there, they moved swiftly but subtly. Suzanne used her legal expertise to exploit loopholes in joint venture contracts, forcing minority shareholders into buyout scenarios where Triple Crown emerged as the only viable buyer. Debbie, armed with her architectural background, proposed redevelopment plans that boosted valuation, giving them the credibility to mask their deeper intentions. They didn't just want shares. They wanted control of the supply chain, the permitting pipeline, the zoning influence. Every move was calculated to strike where Ed wouldn't immediately feel it. A leasing firm here, a development subsidiary there, a consulting group once used by Frankel Hotels for feasibility studies, all acquired under different names, funneled back into the same trust their mother had left behind. Within 10 years, Triple Crown controlled nearly 22% of Frankel Hotels' real estate assets, without Ed ever realizing who was behind the curtain. It was financial jujitsu, using his own weight against him, redirecting what he'd once stolen back into the hands of the daughters he had erased. And the most brilliant part, no one saw it coming. Not yet. After 25 years of silent strategy and surgical precision, the moment finally came. The balance tipped. Triple Crown Investments had acquired a controlling interest in key Frankel Hotel subsidiaries, enough leverage to trigger boardroom panic and legal audits. The sisters had long anticipated this threshold, and when Doris confirmed the final piece of ownership had cleared through their holding trust, the choice was unanimous. It was time to step into the light. No more aliases. No more shadows. They would no longer be ghosts haunting the empire Ed Frankel built on their mother's bones. They would be the storm that tore it down. The decision wasn't made in anger, but in clarity. They had waited for the perfect moment after the fiscal year closed, just as Frankel Hotels prepared to unveil a billion-dollar expansion plan, and with that timing they struck. Suzanne drafted the legal notice herself, a formal request for a shareholders' assembly backed by majority voting power and a motion to freeze board decisions pending review. Debbie oversaw the design of the presentation. They would deliver an elegant, bulletproof blend of financial analysis and architectural legacy, tracing the origins of Frankel Hotels back to Kathy Lawrence and Steve Lawrence, 2 names Ed had worked hard to erase. and Doris choreographed the media rollout, lining up interviews and quiet leaks to industry insiders that hinted at a coming reckoning. Within 72 hours of their official emergence, Triple Crown wasn't just a mystery investor, it was a declared threat to Ed's throne. The board was stunned, executives scrambled, but Ed remained calm, at least on the surface. He didn't yet know who was behind Triple Crown. Not really. He didn't know he was about to come face to face with the very daughters he had discarded on a rainy night a lifetime ago. But they knew. They were ready. And they weren't just coming for a seat at the table, they were coming for the whole house. Suzanne stepped forward and, without waiting for permission, placed a slim black folder at the center of the table. "We're not here to argue," she said clearly, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "We're here to show you what's been hidden for 25 years. She opened the folder and carefully laid out a series of documents, each one a weapon in paper form. First came a notarized copy of Kathy Lawrence's original will, one that predated the revision Ed had submitted to the courts after her death. This version, Suzanne explained, was stored in a private safety deposit box, opened under our mother's maiden name, Lawrence. It was secured with a miniature key, hidden inside a locket she gave us before she died. Debbie reached into her jacket and pulled out the locket, holding it up for everyone to see. He never knew about it, she added, glancing toward Ed. He left before she could tell him it even existed. Doris silently tapped her tablet, projecting high-resolution images onto the screen, behind them scans of the original will, along with timestamps, witness signatures, and notarized verification that matched bank records going back decades. In this version, Suzanne continued. Kathy left her entire share of Frankel Hotels, her intellectual property, and her design patents to us, her daughters, and no one else. There is no mention of Ed Frankel as beneficiary. In fact, she explicitly wrote that she feared he would exploit her legacy. Then came the blue notebook, Kathy's personal design journal, filled with hand-drawn blueprints of hotel concepts that predated Frankel Hotel's founding. Debbie placed it on the table like a sacred artifact. This, she said softly, is the heart of the empire. And it wasn't his. Around the table board, members shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned in, others paled. But the silence spoke volumes. Ed tried to laugh, a hollow, dry sound. "You can't be serious." Doris looked at him then, and for the first time in her life she spoke directly to him. "Oh, we're not just serious, we're prepared." Suzanne didn't waste time. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick document with color-coded tabs and a front page embossed with the insignia of Triple Crown Investments. "Here's the offer," she said, crisply sliding the folder across the table toward Ed and the board members. "A full acquisition proposal. We're offering fair market value for the remaining controlling interest of Frankel Hotels adjusted for inflation. Intellectual property theft, and 25 years of falsified origin claims. It's generous, more generous than he deserves." She looked directly at Ed, unblinking. "You can take it and walk away with your dignity and freedom mostly intact. Or you can fight us in court, in the press, and in front of every hotel guest who walks into a lobby built on stolen dreams." Debbie stepped beside her sister, placing a second folder down, this one thinner but far more dangerous. Inside are sealed affidavits, forensic accounting records, internal emails, witness statements, and timelines connecting Ed Frankel to fraud, document manipulation, and unethical consolidation practices. We haven't released them yet. But if this room doesn't make the right decision, every major news outlet will have it before tonight's evening broadcast. Doris added the final stroke. She activated the screen behind them, revealing a countdown timer ticking ominously from 24 hours. "That's how long you have," she said calmly. "To review the offer, to consult your lawyers, and to decide whether Frankel Hotels continues as a legacy or collapses under the weight of its lies." The room erupted into whispers. Some board members looked panicked, others furious. But no one questioned the reality anymore. These women had receipts, leverage, and the composure of people who had waited their whole lives for this exact moment. Ed stared at the proposal in front of him, his face a flicker of disbelief, rage, and something unfamiliar fear. "You wouldn't dare," he growled. Debbie met his eyes with steel. "We already have. This is your last chance to choose the ending." Within 48 hours of the sisters' ultimatum, the fallout began. while the board scrambled behind closed doors, and Ed's legal team worked overtime to issue weak denials to the press, a much larger force moved in quietly, but with purpose. The FBI's white-collar crime division had been monitoring Frankel hotels for years, but lacked the concrete evidence to trigger formal action. That changed the moment Triple Crown Investments delivered a confidential dossier complete with financial anomalies, hidden subsidiaries, and a digital paper trail so damning it bypassed bureaucracy. What began as a private family reckoning quickly escalated into a full-scale federal investigation. Agents arrived unannounced at the Frankel Hotel's corporate headquarters dressed in dark suits with sealed warrants in hand. They moved swiftly, securing servers, seizing hard drives, and interviewing key executives before news outlets even had a chance to break the story. The financial press caught wind within hours, and suddenly headlines blared across the country. Luxury hotel empire under federal scrutiny. Whistleblower daughters trigger fraud. Probe Frankel hotels faces. Collapse Ed Frankel. Once hailed as a genius tycoon, now found himself facing allegations ranging from securities fraud and tax evasion to embezzlement and falsification of shareholder reports. The documents Doris had uncovered and cross-referenced meticulously revealed a pattern of cooked books, inflated asset valuations, and misappropriated investor funds dating back over a decade. But the real nail in the coffin came from within. A former CFO, lured by a sealed immunity deal, agreed to testify. He confirmed what the sisters had long suspected, that Ed had been funneling money through offshore accounts to shield assets from both taxes and internal audits. Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris watched it unfold, not with triumph, but with grim resolve. This was never about destroying him for sport. It was about justice, truth, and finally dragging into the light what had thrived for too long in the shadows. And as FBI agents wheeled out evidence boxes under the eyes of stunned employees and paparazzi, one thing became clear: the empire built on lies had begun to crack, and there was no patching what came next. While the FBI dug into Frankel Hotel's financial rot, another revelation began to surface, one that sent a deeper, more personal chill through the sisters' veins. When the results came back, the room fell into stunned silence. Traces of digitalis were present, an old but deadly toxin derived from foxglove, nearly undetectable if not specifically tested for. At high enough doses, it could mimic natural cardiac failure. In small, prolonged doses, it could mirror neurological decline. It hadn't been administered by accident. Someone had poisoned their mother. Debbie stared at the lab results with shaking hands, her mother's final hours flashing through her mind with horrifying clarity. How sudden her downturn had been, how dazed she had seemed in her last week, how she whispered that she didn't feel like herself. Doris quietly opened Kathy's design journal and pointed to the final page, a cryptic sketch of a locket next to the words, "If they ever question it, look deeper." It hadn't just been a warning about the company. It had been about her death. And now what began as a financial reckoning had become something far more sinister. The sisters weren't just fighting for a legacy, they were about to uncover a murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a quiet knock at Rosa Taylor's door late one evening, weeks into the investigation. Standing on the porch, clutching a weathered purse and wrapped in a faded shawl, was Linda Vasquez, the Lawrence family's former housekeeper. She had worked for Kathy for over a decade, practically raising the girls alongside her before quietly disappearing after Kathy's funeral, too heartbroken and afraid to face what she suspected. Now, after years of silence, Linda had returned, not with speculation, but with evidence. Her hands trembled as she pulled a small amber glass bottle from the depths of her bag and placed it gently on Rosa's kitchen table. "I don't know why I kept it," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "Something in me just knew." The label had been scraped, but the pharmacy stamp was intact, and inside, sealed tight, were several tablets half-used, dusty with time, but preserved. It was the same bottle Linda had found hidden at the back of the upstairs bathroom cabinet a week after Kathy's death. Ed had told her to clean out the medicine cabinets before the police arrived. He said he didn't want the girls to see anything distressing, but the way he had said it, rushed, nervous, had left a knot in her stomach she couldn't explain. So she kept the bottle. And now, all these years later, that decision proved critical. The FBI's forensic toxicology team analyzed the contents and confirmed what the sisters had feared. The pills contained synthetic digitalis in non-prescription concentrations, the same toxin found in Kathy's samples. Not only that, but the compound was compounded at a specialty pharmacy, one that catered to private clients with custom requests. A subpoena revealed the customer on file, Edward Frankel. With one simple tragic object, a dusty bottle of pills, speculation became proof. Linda's conscience had preserved the very weapon that killed Kathy, and now at last the truth had a name, a date, and a signature. The case was no longer just about stolen wealth. It was about justice for a woman silenced in her prime by the man who vowed to protect her. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun began to cut through the gray skyline above Frankel Hotel's corporate tower. The lobby, once a symbol of prestige with its marble floors and gold-plated reception desk, became the stage for a moment of reckoning, decades in the making. Ed Frankel, dressed in a tailored navy suit and flanked by 2 attorneys, was escorted from the building in handcuffs by 2 FBI agents. Cameras flashed, employees gasped, and a heavy silence fell over the boardroom upstairs, where Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris watched from a private security feed. There was no outburst, no resistance. Just the hollow pride of a man who knew the end had arrived. Moments later, the elevator doors opened, and Chris Delaney, the longtime CFO of Frankel Hotels, stepped into the room carrying a thick envelope. His face, usually unreadable, held a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. "It's done," he said, simply, laying the envelope on the table. "The board held an emergency vote this morning. Majority approval. The acquisition proposal from Triple Crown Investments has been accepted." He paused, looking at each of the sisters in turn. "Effective immediately, the company is yours." Suzanne's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her pulse pounding in her ears. Debbie looked down, blinking rapidly, overcome with emotion. Doris closed her eyes for just a second, as if releasing 25 years of silent grief. Chris continued, "I knew pieces of it over the years, what Ed was doing, what he was hiding. I didn't have the power to stop him, but I wasn't going to stand in the way of justice." He slid the signed agreement forward. "The legacy is back where it belongs." No cheers erupted, no celebrations. Just quiet understanding between the sisters who had fought for years, not to humiliate him, but to honor her, the woman whose name had been erased, whose empire had been stolen. Now, the crown that bore another man's name would finally return to its rightful heirs. And this time, it would be carried by women who had earned every inch of it. In the final hours before his formal resignation was set to be submitted to the SEC, Ed Frankel made one unexpected request. He wanted to meet with the sisters privately. No lawyers, no press, no board members, just the 3 daughters he had abandoned a lifetime ago, and the man who had once stood between them and everything their mother had built. The request came through Chris Delaney, scribbled in Ed's own handwriting on a torn sheet of yellow legal pad. "Before I sign, I want 10 minutes. No cameras. Just them." The sisters debated it. Every instinct screamed that he didn't deserve even a second more of their time. But in the end, they agreed less out of mercy and more out of necessity. Closure wasn't something they expected from Ed Frankel, but they weren't leaving this chapter unfinished. The meeting took place in a quiet, windowless conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Ed was already seated when they entered, no longer the towering CEO, but a man deflated by exposure, stripped of the armor that power and money once gave him. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. He just looked at them. Really looked for the first time in decades. "You're Kathy's daughters," he said softly, almost in disbelief. "Every part of you. The way you walk. The way you stare." Debbie said nothing. Suzanne folded her arms. Doris remained still, eyes unreadable. "I was afraid of what you'd become," he continued. "Afraid that if I kept you around, you'd remind me of the things I didn't earn, the empire that wasn't mine. Your mother..." He trailed off. The silence was brutal. Then, without prompting, he reached into a folder beside him and pulled out a single sheet of paper, his signed resignation. "You won," he said, sliding it across the table. Or maybe... She did. And for the first time in their lives, the sisters didn't feel small in his presence. They felt whole, not because of anything he gave them, but because of everything he had failed to take. After the dust settled, after the contracts were signed and the headlines began to fade from scandal to legacy, the sisters gathered in Rosa Taylor's living room one final time. It was the same place they had first read the trust documents, the same place they had sworn to take back what was stolen. Now, with Frankel Hotels officially under their control and justice for Kathy finally within reach, there was one last envelope to open, one they had kept sealed for over 2 decades per their mother's handwritten instruction. Not until you know who you are. Not until you're strong enough to hold it. It was Doris who unsealed it, her hands steady as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, Kathy's soft cursive full of grace and weight. The letter began with love, recounting how proud she was of the women they were becoming. But then her tone shifted. "There's something I never told you," it read. "Not because I didn't want you to know, but because I didn't want it to define you." The sisters leaned in as Doris continued reading aloud. Kathy explained that long before Ed married her, before he became CEO, he had been someone else entirely, Steve Lawrence's apprentice, a junior architect with potential, but no vision of his own. Their affair had been brief, impulsive, and marked by denial. When Kathy discovered she was pregnant, Ed demanded she keep it quiet. He wasn't ready. He wasn't willing. And so Kathy raised the girls under the name of the man who truly deserved credit, Steve Lawrence, hoping one day Ed would become worthy of the truth. But he never did. "Yes, he is your biological father," the letter said, "but blood is not the same as love. Remember that. Steve was your father in every way that mattered, and nothing will ever change that." The room fell silent. The truth was heavier than they expected, not because it changed who they were, but because it confirmed how much had been stolen. Yet even in that revelation, Kathy had given them power not just to reclaim a legacy, but to redefine it on their own terms. The sisters thought the final conversation with Ed Frankel had concluded, and because she deserves the truth, even if it comes too late. He slid the drive across the table. "Do with it what you will." They were still processing the weight of the USB drive, sitting in tense silence in the private dining room of the estate Rosa had once helped secure for their mother, when the door creaked open without warning. At first, no one moved. Then came the sharp click of heels across the polished marble floor, deliberate, poised, rehearsed. The sisters turned in unison, and there she was, Lucille Rossi. Time had barely touched her. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her tailored suit immaculate. Her expression smooth as porcelain, but behind her cold smile flickered something venomous. "I see the family reunion is in full swing," she said, her voice honeyed and sharp. "How charming." Debbie stood slowly, her fists clenched. Suzanne's eyes narrowed like a hawk. Doris remained seated, her gaze locked and unflinching. Ed, for the first time in years, looked genuinely rattled. His face drained of color as Lucille's presence turned the air electric with tension. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice uneven. Lucille's smile didn't waver. "Oh, Edward, did you really think I wouldn't find out?" "The press leaks the FBI, the board take over your dirty little secrets, unspooling like a bad soap opera." Her eyes moved to the sisters. "And the prodigal daughters. How touching. You've grown into such clever little creatures." Suzanne stepped forward, her voice like flint. "We know what you did." Lucille tilted her head. "Do you, or do you just think you do?" She turned to Ed. "Did you tell them everything, darling? That while you were too weak to kill her yourself, you were perfectly content to let me do what you couldn't?" Ed stiffened. "You poisoned her," he said through gritted teeth. "I have the footage." Lucille chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "Then you'd better hope it never sees the light of day. Because if I go down, Edward, I'm not going alone." For a moment, no one breathed. The walls of polite deceit had shattered. Now it was war, cold, calculated, and decades overdue. And for the first time, all the players were in the same room. With the air so thick it nearly vibrated, Lucille Rossi reached into her handbag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal, aged, scuffed at the corners, and unmistakably familiar. The moment she laid it on the table, Debbie's breath caught. Suzanne froze. Doris's eyes locked onto the object as if it were alive. It was Kathy's journal, not the design notebook they had uncovered before, but something more intimate, more personal. Lucille placed it delicately in front of them, her fingers brushing the cover like she was setting down a relic. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice suddenly stripped of theatrics. Then read this. "I stole it before the funeral. I knew Ed would destroy it, just like everything else that proved Kathy was more than just a stepping stone in his climb to power." Ed lunged forward, but Doris was quicker, her hand slamming down on the journal to stop him. "Don't," she warned. Lucille stepped back, but not before delivering the final blow. "Page 74, she whispered. "Start there." Suzanne flipped through her hands, trembling until she reached it. The ink was shaky, the lines tight, written with a clarity that could only come from knowing death was close. "I've stopped taking the pills Ed brings me. I'm getting worse, not better. Something isn't right. I told Lucille, and she told me to pretend to keep taking them in front of him, but spit them out later. She says she'll help me document it. If something happens to me, they'll know." Debbie's voice cracked as she read it aloud. The sisters looked up in stunned silence, their mother's final words slicing through the fog of years. She knew Doris whispered. But the final irrefutable blow came in the form of a witness, an ex-pharmacist who, under threat of indictment, confessed to receiving direct instructions from Ed Frankel for a custom pain management compound with explicit instructions for it not to be entered into insurance systems. "All signs point to a premeditated plan," Agent Carter stated. Mr. Frankel was aware of Kathy Lawrence's trust, her intention to pass her legacy onto her daughters, and her growing suspicion that he was undermining her health. The combination of motive, opportunity, and forensic evidence meets the standard for formal charges of first-degree murder. Suzanne, Debbie, and Doris watched the broadcast from the same living room where their lives had changed once before. But this time, they were not weeping girls left behind in the rain. They were women witnessing justice, long denied, but finally delivered. Their mother's voice had not gone unheard. Her words, her warnings, her fears had found their way into the light. And now the man who tried to erase her would be remembered not as a titan of industry, but as a killer, unmasked by his own daughters. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing, every seat filled with journalists, former shareholders, former employees, and quiet observers who had followed the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of Edward Frankel. The once celebrated CEO now sat in a wrinkled gray suit, wrists shackled, eyes hollow and fixed on the floor. The trial had been swift, thanks to the overwhelming mountain of evidence: financial records, forged documents, pharmacy receipts, forensic fingerprints, and most damning of all, Kathy Lawrence's final journal entries. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, corporate fraud, securities manipulation, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. The judge, an iron-spined woman known for her intolerance of corporate corruption, delivered the sentence with a voice as firm as stone. "Edward Frankel," she said, "you orchestrated the poisoning of your wife, the erasure of her legacy, and the systematic defrauding of countless stakeholders. Your crimes were not impulsive. They were cold, calculated, and carried out over decades. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." A gasp rippled through the room, not from disbelief, but from the weight of finality. The man who once stood atop a billion-dollar empire would now spend the rest of his life behind steel bars, his name forever stripped of honor. He showed no emotion, no tears, no protest, just a slow blink as though he had expected it all along. In the gallery, Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris sat in silence, hands clasped. They didn't cheer, they didn't cry. They simply breathed for the first time in years, without the shadow of his silence hanging over them. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it arrived like this, measured quiet, but absolute. As Ed was led away in chains, the legacy of Frankel Hotels died with him. But something else, something far more enduring, was just beginning. The name Kathy Lawrence would rise again, not as a victim, but as the true architect of an empire. And her daughters, once discarded, were now its guardians. After the trial, once the gavel fell and Ed Frankel was sentenced to life without parole, the spotlight turned briefly to Lucille Rossi, the enigmatic former assistant, once mistress, now reluctant whistleblower. Her testimony had been damning, vivid, and disturbingly calm. She had taken the stand with practiced composure, describing in meticulous detail how Ed manipulated Kathy's prescriptions, how he pressured Lucille to stay silent, and how she had kept the stolen journal as both guilt and insurance. The courtroom had hung on her every word, unsure whether to revile or pity her. But once her role was complete, once she stepped down from the witness stand and handed over the final piece of evidence, Lucille vanished. There were no public statements, no interviews, no press tours or book deals. She declined every media request, ignored every camera at the courthouse steps, and quietly withdrew from public life. Her last known sighting was at a private airport just outside of town, boarding a chartered flight to an undisclosed destination. Some speculated she left the country entirely, perhaps to Europe or South America, using what remained of her severance and hush money savings from the Frankel years. Others whispered that she had entered witness protection, that the government had cut her a deal in exchange for the evidence she provided. But the truth remained unknown. For all her involvement in the darkest chapters of Kathy's life, Lucille never faced charges. The statute of limitations had passed on her lesser crimes, and there was no direct evidence linking her to the poisoning beyond what she had already admitted. Morally complicit, yes, but legally shielded. And just like that, she disappeared. To some, she was a coward. To others, a survivor of her own making. But to Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris, she was a ghost. Another shadow in the long, tangled story of their mother's death. In the end, Lucille Rossi became what she had always been, a woman who knew too much, said too little, and left before the fire fully caught up with her. And maybe in a way that was her punishment, living with the truth no one else could see in the mirror. In the months following Ed Frankel's conviction and the final handover of the company, the sisters moved forward with one of the most symbolic and emotional decisions of their journey, the renaming of the empire. Frankel Hotels would no longer bear the name of a man who had built his legacy on deception and betrayal. Instead, with unanimous board approval and global press coverage, the brand was officially reintroduced as Frankel Lawrence Hotels, a tribute not only to their mother, Kathy Lawrence, but also to their biological father, Steve Lawrence, the gifted architect whose vision had quietly shaped the original foundation of the empire long before Ed ever took credit. The announcement was made at the company's annual investor summit in New York, in front of a crowd of shareholders, media outlets, and former employees. Debbie stood at the podium with Suzanne and Doris flanking her, each sister representing a pillar of the company's new identity, design, strategy, and purpose. "This is not just a rebranding," Debbie said, her voice steady. "It is a restoration. We are not erasing history. We are correcting it." Behind them on a massive screen appeared the new logo, a stylized FL, interwoven with architectural lines inspired by Steve's original blueprints and colors drawn from Kathy's favorite palette. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Investors who had once backed Ed now applauded the daughters who had exposed him. Doris led the development of a brand relaunch campaign that emphasized authenticity, legacy, and healing. Suzanne ensured every legal step was airtight, and together they signed off on a permanent plaque to be installed in every Frankel Lawrence hotel lobby in honor of Kathy and Steve Lawrence, visionaries, creators, and the rightful founders. For the first time in decades, the name above the doors finally told the truth. The grand relaunch gala of Frankel Lawrence Hotels was nothing short of breathtaking and opulent yet deeply personal celebration that rewrote the legacy of an entire empire in one unforgettable night. Held at the company's flagship property in Manhattan, formerly the Frankel Grand, now renamed the Lawrence Crown, the evening was a convergence of legacy justice and long overdue truth. The venue shimmered under cascading lights with floor-to-ceiling images of Kathy and Steve Lawrence lining the entrance like a tribute gallery. Guests walked a black and gold carpet instead of red, symbolizing both the mourning and majesty of a stolen legacy, finally reclaimed. Inside the ballroom pulsed with quiet reverence as industry giants, former employees, and media elites gathered not to worship corporate power, but to honor vision, sacrifice, and truth. Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris made their entrance to a standing ovation, each dressed in subtle nods to their mother's favorite styles and their father's architectural themes. The centerpiece of the evening was a stirring video montage narrated by Rosa Taylor, weaving together never-before-seen footage of Kathy and Steve at work, his hands drafting blueprints, her voice describing hospitality not as business, but as belonging. The crowd was visibly moved. Tears fell. Applause echoed. Toward the end of the evening, Suzanne took the stage and delivered a speech that left the room breathless. "This isn't a coronation," she said. "It's a resurrection. We were left behind at a gas station 25 years ago. Tonight we reopen the doors our parents were shut out of." At midnight, a gold curtain dropped, revealing the new plaque affixed to the lobby wall. "In honor of Kathy and Steve Lawrence, the heart and mind behind every key turned in these halls." It was more than a gala. It was history, rewritten with the whole world watching. With the name restored and the truth finally anchored in stone, the three sisters turned their focus toward the future, one rooted not in profit or prestige, but in the values their mother had lived and died for: justice, community, and sustainability. Under the unified leadership of Debbie Suzanne and Doris Frankel, Lawrence Hotels began a bold transformation from a legacy brand to a purpose-driven institution. Debbie, drawing on her architectural expertise, launched the Green Legacy Initiative, which mandated that every new property be designed with zero-waste construction principles and powered by renewable energy sources. Old hotels were retrofitted not just for aesthetic upgrades, but for energy efficiency and carbon neutrality, honoring her mother's belief that beauty and responsibility were never mutually exclusive. Suzanne, as head of legal and ethics, implemented sweeping reforms across the company, establishing whistleblower protections, pay transparency, and a reparative justice program that offered restitution to employees wronged under Ed Frankel's regime. She also led a global audit to sever ties with unethical contractors and reinvest in local women-led and minority-owned businesses. Doris spearheaded the Carter Lawrence Foundation, a hospitality education and mentorship initiative for underprivileged youth, named in quiet tribute to Rosa Taylor's late daughter. She ensured that every Frankel Lawrence hotel would partner with community organizations, providing not just jobs but pathways to leadership. At quarterly meetings, instead of shareholder-first presentations, the sisters shared impact reports: carbon savings, lives changed, communities served. What began as a quest for justice evolved into a mission to redefine what a hotel empire could stand for. They weren't just rebuilding a company. They were fulfilling their mother's unfinished dream, a place where people weren't just guests, but seen valued and empowered. And this time, every key opened not just a room, but a future grounded in truth. Amid the glamour and gravity of the gala, just as the final toast was raised and the last speech echoed into silence, a figure slipped quietly into the back of the ballroom, unannounced, unescorted, and nearly unnoticed. Lucille Rossi, draped in a simple black dress, stood behind the last row of golden chairs, her presence more shadow than spectacle. She didn't seek attention. She didn't need to. The sisters saw her almost simultaneously. Debbie's eyes locked onto her first, followed by Doris, whose expression flickered between surprise and something softer. Suzanne gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the complicated role Lucille had played in their story. As the crowd slowly began to shift toward the open terrace for the closing fireworks, Lucille approached, the sisters' measured steps. No theatrics, just the quiet gravity of a woman who had seen too much and said too little. "I wasn't invited," she said plainly. "Didn't need to be." Debbie raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Lucille reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "Kathy left this with me. I wasn't sure when or if you should ever read it. But after everything, I think it's time." Suzanne opened it cautiously, revealing a handwritten note in Kathy's unmistakable script. "Biology doesn't make a man a father. Steve chose you. He stayed. He believed. And that's what makes him yours." Lucille's voice was steady as she added, "I knew it even back then. She may have signed Ed's name on the birth certificate to protect you, but her heart and yours always belong to Steve." Doris blinked back, sudden tears. In that moment, the last thread of confusion unraveled. They had never needed Ed's name to belong. Their real father had always been the man who believed in their mother's vision, and in spirit had never left. Lucille stepped back into the crowd and disappeared without another word, leaving only clarity behind. As the final guests drifted away and the echo of music softened into the background hum of a quiet New York night, the three sisters found themselves alone on the rooftop terrace of the Lawrence Crown Hotel, the very space their mother had once called her sanctuary above the storm. The city lights shimmered below like a sea of restless stars, but up here everything was still. No reporters, no lawyers, no boardrooms, just the wind, the memory of a woman who had dreamed this view into existence, and the daughters who now carried that dream forward. Debbie leaned against the railing, her eyes scanning the skyline. Suzanne stood beside her, arms crossed, thoughtful. Doris walked slowly to the center of the terrace, then turned to face her sisters. "We did it," she said quietly. "But it still doesn't feel finished." Suzanne nodded. "Because it's not. Taking it back was only the beginning." Debbie exhaled, her voice heavy with memory. "Mom used to say, 'Don't just build high, build right.'" The three women looked at one another, then a silent understanding passing between them that needed no explanation. They had won the company. They had reclaimed their legacy. But that wasn't enough, not for Kathy, not for Steve, and not for the little girls who were once left behind in the rain. Doris reached into her pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper she'd carried all evening. It was a scribbled quote from Kathy's journal, one they hadn't shared publicly. "Justice builds taller than any tower." With quiet conviction, she read it aloud. Debbie smiled. Suzanne stepped forward, and together in the sanctuary that once belonged to their mother, the sisters made a final promise not to grow bigger for the sake of pride, but to grow better for the sake of purpose. "We will build something," Debbie said, her voice unwavering, not just big, but right. And under the open sky they sealed it with silence, resolve, and the unshakable bond of truth reclaimed. From the moment they were left behind in the cold rain of a gas station, at just 14 years old, clutching each other beneath the weight of grief and betrayal, the world had written a story for the Lawrence sisters that was meant to end in silence. Girls discarded by power, forgotten by blood, erased by a legacy that never saw them coming. But now, standing at the pinnacle of the empire built on their mother's stolen dreams, Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris had rewritten every line. Their journey, once marked by abandonment, invisibility, and injustice, had transformed into something not only triumphant, but deeply transformational. No longer the daughters of shame, they were now the women of vision, architects of change, protectors of truth, and beacons for all those who had ever been told they were too small, too powerless, too late. Debbie, the designer with fire in her hands and her mother's blueprints in her veins, turned pain into structures that breathed beauty and purpose. Suzanne, the relentless strategist, rewrote the rules of power with precision and compassion. And Doris, once the quietest, became the loudest heartbeat of community, bridging the gap between business and humanity. Together they had not just reclaimed a company, but modeled a new kind of leadership, one rooted in justice, accountability, and love. Their ascent wasn't paved with revenge, but with responsibility, each victory a tribute to Kathy and Steve and to the young girls they once were, scared, soaked, and shivering, but never broken. Now the world didn't see orphans. It saw icons. It saw resilience. It saw women who had every reason to disappear, but instead chose to rise, rebuild, and reimagine what legacy could truly mean. The journey was complete. The scars had become symbols, and the story of the Lawrence sisters would now be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a revolution in heels. The story of the Lawrence sisters does not end with headlines or handshakes, nor with courtroom victories or glittering galas. It ends instead in something far more powerful, a quiet moment of remembrance and truth. As the rooftop lights dimmed and the city hummed below, the final scene belonged not to power or legacy, but to love, the kind of love that refuses to be erased. Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris stood side by side beneath the stars, not as heirs or executives, but as daughters. Daughters of a woman who had believed in justice even when the world had not, and of a man who, though denied recognition in life, had built his heart into every brick of their future. The plaque bearing Kathy and Steve's names glowed softly behind them, more permanent than any building or brand. It was a tribute, yes, but also a promise. Because true love, the kind that fights in silence, endures in shadow, and sacrifices without credit, never disappears. It lingers, it teaches, and it returns. Kathy's love had raised them even after death. Steve's love had inspired them even from the margins. And in every decision the sisters had made, from the first whispered vow to fight back to the final public unveiling of the truth, that love had guided them. The world may forget names. It may bury truths. It may elevate the wrong and silence the right. But love, real love, does not vanish. And justice, though often delayed, never forgets its destination. So let this be more than a family saga. Let it be a reminder to everyone who has been dismissed, discredited, or denied that the truth waits, that love leaves traces, and that one day, no matter how long it takes, justice will come, not for revenge, but for restoration. And when it does, it will bring names back to life, rewrite the record, and remind the world that silence is never the end. In the end, the story of the Lawrence sisters isn't just a tale of revenge or corporate redemption. It's a powerful reminder that even when we're silenced, discarded, or underestimated, our truth doesn't lose its value. It waits quietly, patiently, until we're ready to reclaim it. What happened to Debbie, Suzanne, and Doris can happen in many forms in the real world. People losing their voice in families, workplaces, or systems that value power over principle. But their journey shows us something profound, that healing isn't just personal, it's structural. Justice isn't about punishing the past, it's about rebuilding the future with integrity. This story teaches us that legacy is not what we inherit, but what we choose to honor. True leadership isn't built on control or image, but on truth, compassion, and the courage to face painful history head-on. These sisters didn't just reclaim a hotel chain, they reclaimed their mother's name, their father's brilliance, and their own right to exist fully in a world that once tried to erase them. So what can we learn from them? First, never let the lies others tell about you become the truth you live by. Second, justice takes time, but it is never too late. And third, when you rise, do it with purpose, not just for yourself, but for those who came before and those who will come after. If you've ever felt voiceless, overlooked, or underestimated, let this story remind you your voice matters. Your truth matters. And with time, support, and courage, you can change your story. What part of this story moved you the most? Save this video to revisit the inspiration. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us why truth, love, and justice always win, no matter how long it takes. Comment below your biggest takeaway. We'd love to hear your voice.